Take it away. You're recording now for both.
Okay. So this is the one on the transect.
Transect 1, and
Transect
it is
1.
the Great Rift Valley.
Great Rift Valley.
And this one would be part 2 of the African transect. So it's transect part 2, Great Rift Valley, 6 venues.
Okay. All right, Dr. Geelhoed. We are now going to do transect number 2 of the Great Rift Valley. And we will be doing today the part where we're starting off in Kenya.
Exactly.
And we go from there. And the Great Rift Valley of Africa, I think, is one of the most interesting areas I can imagine to go through, simply because of the incredible geological transformations it has gone through, even in our lifetime.
It is, in fact, Fred. I mean, it's one of the geologic features, probably the only one, that you can see distinctly from the moon. You already heard that, of course, the biggest biologic made by life structure you can see from the moon is the Great Rift Valley.
Absolutely.
This, being much bigger than the Great Barrier Reef, the Great Rift Valley is actually looking at plate tectonics in action, as a big piece of Africa is being shorn off and running right into the underbelly of Asia.
Oh, it is really something else.
And when you're looking at it at ground level, you see the origin of the Earth, because you're looking at magma as it's not that long ago cooled, and all of the perturbances of flow of water. For example, that's the only major north-flowing river on planet Earth, and the reason for that is the Great Rift intercepts all the rainfalls of eastern Africa and channels them north toward another great cleft in the globe, and that is that Europe and Africa had separated in the creation of the Mediterranean. So here's the longest river on planet Earth, 4,004 kilometers from the junction at Khartoum of the Blue Nile and the White Nile coming together. And before that, there's another 1,200 kilometers of the White Nile that comes all the way back to its origin in Lake Victoria. We'll see a lot about that during the course of transect number 3. In transect 1, we explored the whole of the Blue Nile, including its origin right out of the Lake Tana in the highlands of Ethiopia. So in essence, what we've been doing is following the migration of early mankind through the rift. And now we're returning backwards in that time, and backwards a lot in geologic time, because we're looking at the barren Great Rift.
Yeah. Oh, I find the other part of this whole story is basically the movement of man from Africa into the Middle East, and then from there around the world.
And that residua are still there. You can see the cultural adaptations that made survival possible, made for distinct niches that these people fit into. And our niches of transect number 2 were that of the different peoples there. We saw Rendili people. We saw Gatab. We saw people who are Turkana. We saw others. And as they separated, not only did their cultural appearances change a bit, they also changed a little bit in drifting of their languages. So they had Nilotic languages that also combined with a group that was below them that were the Cushitic languages from the great kingdom of Kush. And so we were listening to each of these, and we began with the Samburu, a very colorful people, right at the peak of the mountain range that is the part of the western scarp of the Great Rift. When we entered in our transect, our great mobile surgical units climbed up this moonscape alongside what I call the Grand Canyon of East Africa. And there we climbed up on that ridge. And in fact, when I was talking to you about this originally, I have a very short clip, and I'm not going to show it here in this fullness, but I will say only this 20 seconds gives you an idea that we are traveling out of a moonscape and up into an area of a cultural group, the Samburu people. And I think you can even see, perhaps, at least what the moonscape looks like as we are traveling. You hear the wind funnel that makes the whole of this great Rift Valley an ideal place to engender wind power, which is why Lake Turkana Wind Power was the group that was helping us. We then found the humanitarian organization that's part of that called the Winds of Change, and that foundation is the group that we used as our on-the-ground collaborative unit, such that they were consisting of Rendili people and Samburu people, Turkanic people, and all of those were the help in our translation and identification and knowing what the needs of the people were. So our transect number 2 in Africa was through the Great Rift, as you mentioned, Kenya, but this happens to be the largest county in Kenya. Remember, counties are a relatively recent invention in Kenya because before this they had provinces, and the provinces were disbanded by the prior president, Daniel Arap Moi, because they were getting a bit too powerful with respect to their governors, so he simply abolished them. What that did was revert to county structure, and the counties took over the role of the governors of the provinces, so that in fact now we call what would be the county executive the governor of the county. And this is the largest of the counties and also the most remote, and it's named after one of its features, Marsabit. So this is Marsabit County, and we made a transect of the entirety of Marsabit County, all of it residual within the Great Rift. So this resident county of the Great Rift Valley goes from one ecologic extreme to the other. You have the largest of the saline lakes in all of Africa, and this alkaline lake is Turkana, named after the people, the Turkana people there. We will get to that in our second stop on this transect. But it is both an anthropologic feast in moving from one to another, but it's also a lesson in the geophysics of the origin of the planet.
I hate to say this, but you're bringing back all kinds of memories because
I hope.
In 1956, when I was in the Royal Artillery, our regiment, I almost went to Kenya with the Mau Mau problem.
Yes.
And instead of that, ended up in Cyprus. So, at any rate...
in fact, they are exercising the royal constabularies of the British forces, and we passed one of the convoys there with their characteristic rovers going off into the desert to do desert maneuvers. So it's still part of the Commonwealth. And as a piece of the Commonwealth, as part of my purview, being a Commonwealth chief, and so as a consequence, we were welcomed there. This isn't something that we intruded into. But moreover, the fascination to me is not only are we going to a remote area, the remoteness also relates to the people and the access these people have, which is quite limited to anything. They are not even aware, some of them, that they are Kenyan. They are very aware that they are Samburu. They are very aware that their cousin is the village chief in the next village over, a village of maybe 500 people. So this is a real thing that we are dealing with, essentially the frontier of the early civilizations.
Do you happen to recall how far south Herodotus went in his journey?
I do not. I know that he was puzzled forever about how the Nile River originated, and it was Pliny the Elder and others who kept saying, ex Africa vini aliquid novi. Out of Africa, always something new and novel and special is coming. And that's true for me today. It was true for Herodotus, who quoted Pliny in making that. But I do not know the apogee in terms of equatorial reach that Herodotus
I often
made.
wondered how far south he went.
He was on the Nile. I never knew about the Blue or the White Nile. And the Nile is 4,004 kilometers long from the Khartoum combination. This is one of those unique things on planet Earth that I have a chance to say, I've been at every significant point of the Nile River, and this trip actually took care of a couple more of those, because in Transect 1, I floated into the origin of the Blue Nile from Lake Tana. In this trip, in the Transect number 2, I floated into the origin of the White Nile out of Lake Victoria. So that on each of these, and on a prior occasion, I had stood in what is called in their language the Milgram. The Milgram is the confluence. And the fascination of that is that the Blue Nile, coming roaring through the highlands out of that rocky gorge, coming out of what they call the smoke that thunders, the Blue Nile Falls, the same name that they give to Lake Victoria's Falls. The Victoria Falls, which comes out of the area of the Zambezi River. When we look at that, we see that what they're talking about is smoke that thunders is the mist that makes the noise that comes out. Both of those are the same name, but they're transliterated in different languages. And now, that Milgram, where the two rivers come together, you can stand, quite literally, and I have done so, with a foot in a Blue Nile and a foot in a White Nile. The biome is totally different. You can catch fish. I remember very well befriending one of the local native fishermen who is catching fish from the Blue Nile, which has a lower density of fish life than the White Nile does, because the White Nile is filled with vegetative material. You see floating grassy islands. You see all these hyacinths and the blooms, hyacinths being an import from Asia at a much later time. And it turned out that there were different species of fish. They're 3 meters apart, but they're in different rivers, even though they flow in the same channel. And from that flowing together, at that point, it isn't 23 kilometers later that they finally mix. And that is at Omdurman, 23 kilometers later. Right. So that the Blue and White Niles are distinctive rivers flowing in the same channel from Khartoum, which itself has an interesting story. In that language, Khartoum means the elephant's trunk. Because if you see the ears of the elephant out here and then coming together in the trunk, that confluence is Khartoum. And Khartoum is the name of the capital now of what is North Sudan, formerly Sudan, before the schism only 12 years ago. So as a consequence, we're looking at the biologic history, which is totally dependent on the geologic history, which is mostly prehistory. We have no idea of the volcanism that brought this about from the split in the Earth's crust, exposing the magma. And you see these cinder cones and lava bombs all along the way around Lake Turkana. We encountered these things that are bowling ball-sized chunks of pumice. We also know that from Ethiopia comes a river called the Omo, and the Omo runs into Lake Turkana. It's a principal feeding river because there's very little rainfall at all in the Great Rift Valley. And as a consequence, over time, with the heavy sun radiation bringing out a lot of that water, it has become alkaline, it is becoming saline, and it too will be one of the great natron lakes of the Rift Valley. A little bit further south in that Kenyan area, you come to places that are called Lake Natron, for example, which has 3/4 of the flamingos on planet Earth. And the reason is the only life forms that live inside the 10 or 20% saline, as the lakes have variability, are the brine shrimp. And the filter feeders of the flamingos, with their upside-down smile, the flamingo's smile, filters out those brine shrimp. So that's where 3/4 of them on Earth. One of the fascinating things for me is taking these small chartered aircraft that we have to move around in there, flying over it and seeing this pink cloud in the middle of the lake. And the lake, of course, is loaded with bird life that feed on this saline-loving, halophilic, to use the Greek terms for it, sea life inland. And it's not the same consistency as the sea life in the sea because the salinity is twice as high. So as a consequence, we're looking at extreme remote life forms in an even more remote geologic formation. And the part about that that's really fun is to see that there are humans that have populated even these remote little crevices in the planet and have had unique adaptations to it. Along with that, they have unique problems. And with the multi-capacities of the beautiful mobile surgical units, we're able to go and address them directly and help teach some of the folks how to care for their own problems in each of these civilizations, each of which were an anthropologic treat.
Huh. Wow. You know, coming back again, memories coming back. The commander of our battery in the army was had actually in World War II fought the Italians down in that area. Anyway,
that's because the spillover from what was then Abyssinia, which later became Ethiopia, that was the Italian colony, and there are some very elderly people in both Ethiopia and a later breakaway state. The only coastal part of Ethiopia was on the Red Sea. Red Sea in Greek, Eritrea.
Eritrea.
And so that piece now
okay.
is the group that still uses the Italian language. And I was there in the highlands of Ethiopia on their Independence Day, their revolution against the Italian colonists. And as a possibility there is you can see some of these people who still speak Italian. Number one, this is in Ethiopia. And in the top of the Great Rift that we were in, those are areas that require the migration of the cattle cultures. There's so little water that they have to constantly move to find out where that water might be. And because there's so little water, the grazing is so sparse that they have to constantly keep on the move. So they are unaware of where that border is with today's Ethiopia. We, coming down, actually crossed on a road. It was interesting to us because we drove the big mobile surgical units across the border, driving on the right side of the road until we came to that border. We gave them our pass and then turned to the left side in order to drive down through the Commonwealth of Kenya, at which point the road vanished. So that we were on a road driving on the right side, then the left side, and then to roadlessness. And the roadlessness you just saw as we emerged out of that Grand Canyon of the Rift Valley, up over the mountain into Geelhoed was our first stop, our first venue of the 6-week villages, 1 week at a time we had gone to, and the first group were the Samburu people. A very, very colorful start.
Well, tell me, was our major accurate when he said that the blue in their Ethiopian language is the same as saying black? And it explained why the river they called blue was really in their language black,
Yes.
from all the sediment from the runoff in that rainy period.
And in fact, that is true. When I said that the two rivers coming together at Khartoum, the one of them is loaded with minerals, the other one is loaded with vegetation. It comes from the more stagnant, slower flowing of the White Niles, and so that there are whole floating reed banks. There are papyrus everywhere. There are these huge floating islands. In fact, in Sudan, when I worked in that area of the world, once a year, the group would make together a floating raft. The raft would be much like you see in Lake Titicaca from the same kind of papyrus reeds. And they would float it downriver. By the time they got to the place where they were going to be, at that point the thing was disintegrating. It didn't matter too much because the cattle that they carried were being eaten up their own conveyance, the raft itself. And then they would make the return trip during the dry season because the whole of the Great Sud, Italian South, the language meaning the largest wetlands on planet Earth, because of the inundation that happens annually in a cycle, which of course enriched all of the area that you're interested in the floodplain of the Nile. Yeah. So there would be no Egypt without a Nile. There would be no Nile without the predominant rainfall in one part of the year that comes on down the White. And there would be no Nile without the highlands of Ethiopia, which can capture the sparse rain clouds as they come from the Indian Ocean during half of the year and cause the precipitation that comes down the Blue Nile. So the Nile is perpetual. Many rivers in Africa dry up for more than half of the year. Well, with the two origins, Herodotus was right. Out of Africa, always something new and wonderful is emerging. And it was Pliny the Elder who is puzzled over this and saying, by all means, we've got to know how this magic occurs such that there is an annual, perennial, continuing Nile flow that nourishes the cattle cultures of the Delta. That wasn't known until the people that I visited on this very track. Their remains are there, at least, at the origin of the White Nile Lake Victoria. And that was Speke and his Richard Burton colleague. And they were the ones who had come inland across the Horn of Africa, which was not at all an easy trip. I can assure you that it hasn't changed much since then because we got stuck in the great Somali desert, and the peoples that were there were largely those that got there by their camel caravans, which we ran through not hundreds, but thousands of camels in a given caravan moving from one point to another to find the waters. They then saw this great lake. It is a great lake, and it is the greatest of the Great Lakes. And the Great Lake Victoria was named after Her Majesty, the queen of all the world. At that time, she was Imperatrix.
Virtually, yeah.
And she had no sun setting on her flag. And as a consequence, they named it after her. But to be sure, Richard Burton was a good scientist and said the water flow in the Nile is more than can be accounted for by the White Nile coming in. There must be another source, so don't go tell anybody about this. And Speke agreed to that, and then went home earlier than Burton, who wanted to see that there was no other origin into the Lake Victoria that would account for the Nile flow. So he made the long trek all around the biggest lake in all Africa, one of the biggest lakes in the world. He made it around and came to Jinja, that part where the Nile emerges, and there decided, yes, in fact, this could possibly be the origin of the Nile. And as he said that, he was now moving his way back home and found out that 2 years earlier, a fellow named Speke had gone to the Royal Geographic Society and announced, I have discovered the origin of the Nile. That is the puzzle that fascinated and obsessed many of the people in the world for a long period of time. And here he had answered that question. He was not reticent about saying, yeah, I found it. And then there was a debate upon the return of Richard Burton, and it was going to be held at the Royal Geographic Society. To set the stage for that, being a hunter-gatherer myself, I should point out that Speke had pretty well kept the expedition alive by his hunting skills, and he was a superbly expert hunter in all the aspects, and knocking down antelope and bird shooting and everything else like that. So he fed the whole expedition. So he was an expert. But it seems that the morning of the great debate, where he was to square off with Richard Burton and explain why it is that he had slipped up on the bargain and had gone to announce the origin of the Nile in his discovery before Burton could confirm it, which, by the way, he was half correct, that the volume of the Nile could not be accounted for by its origin from Lake Victoria. The Blue Nile had yet to be discovered as its origin at the Khartoum to make the main trunk of the Nile. And as a consequence, Speke went out bird shooting, grouse hunting in his native areas from Scotland. And to be announced very dramatically, Richard Burton is sitting at the front of the Royal Geographic Society shuffling his note cards. He was not very accommodating to modern civilization in the Victorian era.
By the way, you better correct everyone about which Richard Burton you're talking about.
There are two Sir Richard Burtons in history, and this was not the dramatic. He was far more dramatic in his life than was the dramatist who married Elizabeth Taylor. But the fact is, he was up there shuffling his cards, and there was a delay, and Speke was late. And finally, the usher, sort of like the usher in the House of Representatives, Mr. Speaker, in this case, Madam Speaker, there's been an accident, and Speke has shot himself, and he is dead. And it turns out that he alleged to be climbing over a fence with his double-barreled shotgun and tripped allegedly and discharged both barrels into his chest. That was obviously a cover story for a suicide where Speke was not at all happy about confronting the fellow that he had hunted for and been with for the many years of their exploration of Africa, finding a good deal of the origins of this Nile, especially with respect to the White Nile. So yes, it is a trip through Victorian history. It is a trip through Herodotus and Pliny the Elder and the others of earlier history, and it is a trip through prehistory of a geologic type.
And don't forget Cleopatra. She was the one who went to Axum and then went up to Lake Tanya.
Yes.
And discovered and was told by the locals that that was a source of the Blue Nile.
It is. It is in the Blue Nile, in their language, black.
Yeah.
And in fact, there's a falls there, the Blue Nile Falls, which formerly was roaring and magnificent. And to show you another change in history and what the demands are for capital exchange as well as people traveling. That Blue Nile was then harnessed by the Italians, who made a cofferdam above it, diverted it all through a hydroelectric dam. And as a consequence, the Blue Nile Falls, which is this magnificent piece of rock face, is diminished down to a small little trickle. Well, when I was there, I had come and we had had a local guide. You can only go with a local guide. And I had got the local guide who phoned ahead. And by phoning ahead, they turned off the sluices into the hydroelectric, so they turned on the falls, because their theory was they're going to make a lot more money from the tourism and from the beauty of the natural history here than they will by the hydroelectric. So they're talking about disposing of the Italian colonial dam and reverting it back to the Blue Nile, because they know what it's doing in the other parts of the world where people come in droves to see the magnificence of the fall. So I was there in time to have the Blue Nile Falls turned on for me. And while there, you could see the volume swell, and so there were multiple towering cascades as opposed to the small one when we first arrived. And even a fellow sitting there playing his shepherd's flute, all of it made to order for the single source they have for revenue now, much greater than the hydroelectric energy.
Well, what did we start off with here?
We started on our way into the Great Rift through Geelhoed, the first venue. And as I said, it's Samburu. And Samburu are very, very colorful people. Many people know from the wanderings of the Maasai tribe, one of the other Kenyan tribes that goes through the rift. And they know their colorful history, and they know that the fellow who has got to get his manhood by proving himself, spearing a lion. After all, they are cattle culture, and that's another predator preying on their cash currency. So the Moran, from the people who know about Maasai culture, is a very similar Moran in a Samburu culture. And they are colorful in the extreme. Once you become a man, meaning that you can now wear either the lion mane head, that would be a very, very high official, or the colobus monkey head, and you would be carrying a knobkerrie, which is a little club with a big knot on the end of it, or a spear. The spear is for the sake of protecting your flock from the lions. Now less so and more so to keep it from the raiding from the cattle rustlers that might be going after you. And that includes a number of your other cattle culture second cousins. The Rendili and the Samburu and the Turkana are all vying over grazing rights and water access, because they're all cattle culture, essentially cattle worshippers. Not an uncommon theme all through the delta of the Nile. So as a consequence, the Samburu are very colorful people. And when we arrived up in Geelhoed, this is a beautiful little hospital. And I know of it from its prior origin because it was at that time belonging to the Africa Inland Mission, AIM. That's when there were missionaries that were expatriates, many of them Americans, some of them British, and a few others, all of whom then set up these multiple little mission stations around the most remote areas. As the expatriates left and there were attempts to indigenize the care, the fellow that had been there was actually German. And when he left the operating room, small room, with some facilities in it, but no skills. No one knows how to use them. There were big sheets covering them and keeping the dust off from them, but there was nobody who knew how to use them. And that's our principal mission as Mission to Heal, to bring care to the bottom billion, to inspire and to transform the lives of those who are with us in their transformational learning. But the third and the critical piece is to indigenize the care. So we need to leave the skill behind. So our job was to pull those sheets off those pieces of equipment and to teach people there locally, which we did with actually a very clever piece of U.S. technology today by calling up in the middle of her night and the fresh part of the morning for us. We had a sonography demonstration from an Iowa sonographer. And this woman had gotten up in the middle of the night before she had to go off to work and spent an hour. And we had a pregnant woman who was standing by. That was not too much of an exception, because every woman of impregnable age is either nursing or carrying a baby that will be born shortly. because they do like 35 to 50 deliveries a month in this small hospital, now called AIC, Gatab Hospital, Africa Inland Church, which means it's entirely controlled by and indigenized. So what we did is in this place is to bring to them some surgical care. They were really excited about the capacity once again to bring operation to this small village, because remember, when there was a doctor there, he would do an occasional cesarean section or do some other things that related to trauma. Since that time, what they would have to do is call. They would call through a very sketchy connection down to Lake Turkana, and there they had a Toyota Land Cruiser diesel ambulance. The ambulance would often not have fuel. It would often have 2 of its tires missing and things like that. But if a woman were in obstructed labor, for example, they'd have to call, they'd have to see if they could get that vehicle to come on up the mountain, the same trek you just saw on our film here, and then carry her down to Marsabit. I just described 43 hours of roadless, heavy-duty travel for a woman in obstructed labor. If you want to tell her to put her knees together and just grit it out and bear and tough it through, that doesn't sound like a very successful prepartum course of treatment. And in consequence, when I talked to the people on my scouting trip before, they were very excited that we would come and get them some surgical skills. And the reason, of the last 5 women sent out in obstructed labor, 1 of them arrived. The other 4 died en route. And the one that arrived was not actually in full-term labor, and the labor stopped, so she probably didn't need the evacuation after all. Even more startling, when I talked to the people there, they gave me stories which were very fascinating, because they're not dealing with just somebody who's unknown to them. They were talking about their uncles and their aunts, because they had chosen to be there. Not only do they know the language, but they have interrelationships that are 2 and 3 generations deep. And everyone there seemed to be related to one of the caregivers in some indirect fashion. What I was fascinated to see then is that they were very, very heavily motivated to do this. They weren't eager to learn the skills so as to get out and go to Nairobi, and then perhaps from Nairobi to Washington, D.C., because they were saying, it was my uncle. And I'd explain, what was that you said about your uncle? Well, he had this big swelling, and he had a toothache, and then the toothache got to be very big, and then he couldn't open his eye, and then, well, we called the ambulance. The ambulance came the next day, and they tried to bring him to Marsabit, and he died 4 hours down the roadless mountain. Dying of a toothache? Well, this is a particular problem. The dental abscess can go into this thing that we call Ludwig's angina, where the airway is crushed. And as a consequence, I said, well, that must be a unique one-off experience. And no, this was the 4th fellow. None of the 4 survived. So that made it very important for us to bring dental kits. And what we did is, with these kits that are relatively inexpensive and very quickly learned and easy to use, at each of the venues in the 6 places we had been, we taught people the extraction of impacted dental abscesses so that there would be drainage through where that tooth was. So I hope that was the last of the lethal referrals for just a dental abscess. And I hope that that will continue for a couple of other reasons. They sent me multiple women alleging that they were in obstructed labor because they needed a C-section. And after all, their need for a C-section was largely predicated on my being there. So what would happen with the 2 very, very capable nurses, remember 2 nurses, meaning 24/7, 365, that they would be working 12 hours a day and night, and they were often busy all night doing a delivery or so. I would turn them over to them and then say, well, I will help you do this cesarean section should it be needed. And Pumisa, particularly, a lovely woman who is just superbly gifted, said, let's see what we can do with them. And each of the 4 women that were referred to me for cesarean section were successfully delivered vaginally by Pumisa. So we didn't get the chance to show them the C-section techniques. However, they were very, very competent midwives, and they did their obstetric deliveries rather than an abdominal delivery. Many other things, though, we did teach them. We taught them, besides the dental abscess, helpful extraction techniques, we also did a number of things that involved excision of lumps. This is the one I'd like to tell you about because it's kind of fun. There's a fellow sitting out in front who looks like he was painted up by central casting and brought in with the full flurry of all the feathers and the headdress and his spear and his knob curry, and he was there. And why? Because this being the dry season, there's a confluence of people that come together because it's easier to travel. They're all there for a wedding. And the wedding is a very big deal, and it involves the ultimate sacrifice, which means you take your prize bull. So here's a Samburu bull, who's a white bull standing there. He doesn't know yet that he's a principal part of the ceremony. And so they invited him to dinner, shall we say. And so we were invited to witness the event, which was a whole lot of dancing. And the dancing is familiar to those of you who know the Maasai jump dance. In essence, standing in an erect, full, no movement, you just suddenly spring way up, which is what you're supposed to do if you're a cattle culture warrior, the Moran, to see long distance in the plains of the Great Rift Valley to see if there's an approaching predator. You can't climb a hill if there's no hill to be climbed, unless you have an ant hill nearby. So their skill is in how high they can jump vertically from a standing start. So they exercised this, and we did this on video, and we did this, and they were inviting us to come and participate. And I said, well, you know white men can't jump. Nonetheless, we got involved in the singing, the chanting, and we loved it a lot. I did not participate in the execution of the Samburu bull because I was coming there as a healer rather than as a killer, and I suggested I keep that role intact. Nonetheless, this was venue one, the Samburu, very colorful, and the skill that we had carried there, we hoped to indigenize, was successfully done. So that on day one, I did most of the operations in the mobile surgical unit with a rotation of the healthcare workers. On day two, I did all of the operations on table one and assisted those on table two, often getting them started on one table and moving to the other, and then coming back again. And on day 4 and day 6, I did none of the operations. They were all done by the local people with the skill that had left behind when we left. Now, one of the things that we're going to do on this next series of transects, which we wanted to do at this time, but the skill and the people that were available were so thin that we couldn't. We were going to take one of the personnel that we had just taught and carry them with us to the next venue. They then would be going in 1 week time from the trainee to the trainer. So they would be the consultant in training the next group. That will happen in our next transects of 2020. We had planned to do it in 2019, the problem being that there were so few personnel that we had to be careful about taking one away when they would not have any residual care. Venue 1, the Samburu and Gutab, a wonderful and a colorful event. I hope some of you see at least the images, if not the videos, that are made available online. But it was a very gratifying experience, and the people there were very welcoming and had a very high receptivity to it. One of our better missions, and it was only the first of the 6 venues that we did in Transect 1.
Wow. That was something.
And from the top of Gutab, we're looking down on Lake Turkana. As I said, the largest alkaline lake in all of Africa. And it is a very large, just looking at it, you can see it defines the Great Rift. If you say, here I am, look, you see, here's Victoria, the origin of the White Nile. And now look over here, that's Lake Turkana. And so this you can just see is the schism in Africa. It goes all the way down to Malawi. Lake Malawi is the furthest southern lake in the Great Rift.
Wow.
And that's 10,000 kilometers right out into the Gulf. 10,000 kilometers is something you can not only see from the moon, but even far beyond that. And that we now were looking down from the mountain on Gutab, looking at the Turkana Lake, and that was our next venue. Our next venue was a place called Langulani, and it had 2 groups. The Turkana, who are the principal group that does their transects from that village. their own moving around for their cattle. And next to them are the Moro. The Moro has the distinction of being the smallest tribe in all of Kenya, and it is likely to be the one that goes extinct first, so that there is some urgency to learning their language and learning more about them. They were fascinating to me because they are small and stunted people. They usually have a lot of problems that are not generally seen in the rift, and some of those problems relate to the fact that they live on and virtually in Lake Turkana, which, as I said, is an alkaline lake. So their phosphorus intake and other things about them make them into moving physiologic museum pieces. They have what we would call rickets from an earlier time in history. They're crumpled up and they have physiologic problems. There are a number of other things that happen to them, and I had one of the men who had come to me, and I studied him fairly carefully, and he had a serious problem, a gastric carcinoma, but it was already in his liver. He's one of the fellows who's the chief of the local tribe. And I looked at him, and I was concerned about him, and we tried to get him out so he could have therapy. But he was very reluctant to move away from his language. Remember, there are only 500 people, and they're the only people that understand you. He's not going to go to a place where they speak Kiswahili, for example, which is a national language of Kenya. I went to the area and had a ride out with him on their very primitive little boats into Lake Turkana, onto an island. The island has a special significance to them as well. The island had several huts. One of those was a transition from boyhood to manhood. It's very much the same as other cattle cultures and what their rituals are. But the second one is a hut that's very special. And coming into contact with the government of a nation state, which they're hardly aware of, that government doesn't want them to do this. But the mark of a man to be the head of the village is to spear a hippo. Now, there are hippos in Lake Turkana. We saw them. There are hippos in Lake Omo. And the government has recognized that this is so much a part of their culture that they're going to allow this, but only 2 hippos a year, so that there are only 2 new village leaders that can be initiated by this rite. And as a consequence, the hippos are preserved, but more importantly, the people are not being preserved because the need for a number of those to kill hippos is diminishing as the population decreases. So the Moro people, I may have had one of the last good glimpses as an anthropologist on the tour to see and record and to look at them and to see their culture. They come to this hut and they go through a week's purification in the middle of the lake, and they are, after that point, all painted up, and then they go out in their essentially balsam log canoes, find and identify and spear a hippo, and then come back and are officially part of the ruling elite of the Moro. That's not a position that's very difficult to attain, since there are not that many people in the Moro group. The women are remarkable because they are the ones that take all the fish that the men catch, either by spear or by net, and they split them open and hang them out in the Great Rift Valley sun, and they dry almost immediately, and so they have a very high protein, very low carbohydrate diet. So they have a very distinctive diet which has kept them alive, but they're inbreeding because they are in only 2 small villages. One is about 300 and the one we visited, and there are 2 others of about 50 each. And they are all in these little fishing camps around Lake Turkana. Fascinating. The Turkana people themselves are very much like the cattle cultures elsewhere. And they all came to us in their full regalia, their full colorful outfits. And they were all concerned about what most of the Rift Valley people are concerned about. Fertility of their cattle and of their women. And they're interlinked. The reason is, to purchase a bride, you need a bride wealth of a certain number of cattle. And in order to do that, you have essentially a mark of your wealth walking in front of you. When you have a mark of your wealth standing out there in the Great Rift and having to be very mobile because limiting grazing, right, and very little water, you're constantly exposed. And you're exposed formerly, I guess you could say, to the predators of the plain. And they included a number that we saw: lions, jackals, hyenas. We could hear them by night. But more importantly now, you're opposed to the other cattle culture peoples who are trying to skim them off. So in two places we saw casualties of the fender rubbing on the borders of Turkana and Samburu land. In one instance, the Samburu was the victim, and in the other instance, it was the Turkana that were victims. So there are long-standing feuds that go through there. And our transect number 2 in Africa ended on a note in which some of the people who were the Gabat people in Les Samas, including the Minister of Health from Marsabit County, whose uncle was involved, was killed in a very big raid by the Ethiopian-based peoples who came on down in the same cattle culture raids, and there were 12 casualties. There is a problem that remains there, essentially fighting over a small piece of survival resources, water and grass. And that is something that's gone on for millennia before there were nation states, and now the nation state is called to adjudicate that. Turkana, a fascinating and a magnificent piece of distant, remote people, the furthest peoples first. We moved out from that, and something that you're going to have to hear about only because I say it's very remarkable. Our venue number 3 was going up to Kurungu. We left out of this moonscape, and as we left, it was a time of year when they say it only happens once every other, or now every other third year. There's some clouds in the sky. There are not many clouds in the Rift Valley sky. In this instance, what we saw was a thundering and a low-hanging cloud rolling over the rift. Well, as we drove up through that same moonscape with the lava bombs and the cinder cones and everything else around us, some raindrops hit the front of the windscreen of the Mancat. After that, quite a few of them did. After that, I turned on the windshield wipers, not something I'd expected to do in the Great Rift Valley, and then climbed up the hill as it began to rain, let's say, in earnest. The capacity for the Great Rift Valley to absorb any of this, remember there's essentially no organic material on the surface. It's all rock. Started rolling at us, and we had some of these bowling ball-sized lava bombs rolling past us. One of them hit our wheel, and we spun it off into the air. And it began to rain in earnest. It then gullies out and erodes all along the track that we were using. The mobile surgical unit was going forward. There was a heavy washout in one side, and we were trying to go through when the people from the Winds of Change had sent a 4x4 Toyota ahead of us to say, we'll show you the way. They then backed up on what would have been the solid ground and stayed there while we came with the mobile surgical unit in order to avoid hitting them. I went off the road, and going off the road, the vehicle turned to 39 degrees, another indicator on the, and so we said, okay, it's toast. We can't get it out of there. It'll be there forever. No, that's not a problem. The Toyota Land Cruiser pickup truck was in the road and said, uh-oh, he's gone. We better get out of here, and tried to slip away. And in doing so, they fell into the roaring river. And I said, well, if you'll just back away here for a moment. We took out this thing that we have called a bubba rope, which is a hawser. And it has a nylon capacity like the Anaconda hawser, such that it can stretch a little bit so it doesn't snap all at once. So my rescuer, the guide in the Toyota pickup truck, was rescued by the Mancat, just going into its six-wheel drive, and we returned it and pulled it back out. So what we did is we came through the first of the major rainfalls that had been seen in the 3 years, showing that the Mancat was able to take care of the desert in the Great Rift and also handle the first of the deluges. In that deluge, we arrived at Kurungu.
Wow. My goodness.
Kurungu was wonderful, wonderful. I mean, if we're talking about a high point here, I'd say it was probably one of them. For one reason, the nurse that I had met, the nurse midwife, named Rose, she's not only one of those self-sustaining, self-stimulating, remote pillars of the society, she also said she really was eager in the dynamic situation that medicine was to learn more, and she hadn't had anyone teaching her anything since she had been in grammar school. And I said, that's our principal function here. So we had our tutorials, as we always do, each day, going over the cases, each day having a topic assigned to each person so that every one of them has to do a little research. I'm sort of the Google source at that point because there's no other access, no library. And I prime one of the people to use that as their lead point, and they become the go-to person from that point. So Rose was fascinated with this process and also learned, putting on her green apron, going to her 24/7, she has no backup. And we did lots and lots of cases, including some very extensive burns. One of them was a less extensive but very disabling burn, was of a small boy who had a burn of his hand from a fire. And so he had only these fingers that worked. And as a consequence, these were contracted down into his palm. And I said, here's one we'll do. He may be about 7 or 8 years of age. He was wearing a very dusty kind of little jacket because, remember, for them it was cold. It rained, after all, so it cooled off the environment. For us, it would hardly be called cold since it dropped into the 60 degrees Fahrenheit department. He then came on in, and I said, let's have a go and train the local people on how to do something to release that. If you just simply release those scars, then what would happen is that they would scar back together, and he'd probably have a worse non-functioning right hand. He'd already tried to adapt by working with his left hand, although he was right-handed. In doing this, we said, here's a little technique, and we will make sure that nobody thinks he's had an appendectomy or a hernia repair. We make a little ellipse on each side of his abdomen and take out a full-thickness piece of skin, take all the fat off from it. Now, full-thickness skin graft won't contract, so he won't recontract. So what we did is release that and then put a splint on him. And as he came back to see me the following day, he wasn't wearing that dusty little rag that he used sort of as a jacket. He was wearing instead a T-shirt, and it said, University of Texas Longhorns. So you knew that I was going to take his picture, and I sent that to my twin grandsons, who are now Longhorns in Austin, Texas, saying, this one's for you guys. And there will be a reason that I did that. You'll know it when we talk about transect number 3 in Africa, because they accompanied me, as they had 2 years before in the Amazon, this time their inauguration in Africa. There were a number of other wonderful cases that were done there, but here's probably the single thing I'd want to report about Rose and Karungu. We worked very hard up until the final day, and I was alone there with only Sam, the fellow who's going to be our coordinator. So we finished our last cases, and there were 2 or 3 patients that had been walking a long way when they heard that we were available. So they came on in with big lipoma or lump or something like that, and I said, hey, come on in, we'll take care of that. Watch. So I said, Rose, and I said to the other fellow who had come with us from Turkana, named Tobias, a freelance nurse, carry on. And they did. They did a very good job. And to make sure everyone knew that, I stood out in front of the clinic saying, the procedure's ongoing in there by the people who know how to do this. And so we made a very big advertisement that it was they who were going to be caring for their people and they who would be teaching them. We did a little climb up Mount Nebo among camels that were grazing from the local nomadic unsettled people. And as I came on down the mountain, Rose had said to me there's a special celebration she wanted to make sure we were back in time for, and she wanted to have us see it. And what she had brought me back for was that she had had the Samburu beaded bracelets made with our names in it for each of us, which is a very nice gesture, but that wasn't the thing I'm about to tell you. What was really heart-tugging is she said this was the most remarkable event she'd ever had and the single best teaching experience she'd ever had. She'd never learned so much. And she wanted to promise 3 things, one of which is every day thereafter would be better than the day before because they would indigenize the piece that was most important to Mission to Heal, and that was the educational component, which means that they were going to continue the tutorials, and one time every 3rd tutorial would be what we call an M&M or a DNC, morbidity and mortality or death and complications. And they would discuss each of the complications they had in order to prevent having them repeated. So in other words, make a skill into an institutional memory so that it was going to remain behind. To remember that event, she said, we would like to come and have a little ceremony. So the local chief and Rose and one of the religious healers planted the Mission to Heal Memorial Grove in a desert. They put sycamore trees on top of goat manure and a couple of other things and planted them in a little plaque which says Mission to Heal Memorial Grove. And she says, now when you come back the next time, we'll go to the next level, but you'll see that they have grown and so have we. So I think Rose is the full spirit of what we hope to do with Mission to Heal. That was the most touching ceremony I'd had in all of the transect.
Quite something. Okay, now tell me, no one will believe this. When is your next trip?
4 days away. Actually, we're headed out a week from today, Saturday being January 11th, and we're going to be going right back into Uganda, which was the end of Transect 3, and then I return for only a week's time, and then head back to the areas we're describing now in Transect 2. We'll be going back to Karungu. We'll be going back to all of the areas that Winds of Change had identified for us in order to bring them to the next level. And as I said earlier, the good thing about it is that we'll be able to teach one of the local people in that venue and then carry the highest performing person, they have to compete for this, with us to the next venue so that they are the trainer of the subsequent group. This makes a network so that if we are gone, they don't have to call America to find out what to do with the problem. They call the next village over where the person that taught them how to do it resides. And as a consequence, this is going to create a skill that is institutionalized memory. They're all going to be together in it. So that'll be coming up next. We had 2 more in this sequence after Karungu. We went off to a place called Buriaramia, which is in the Core Desert. Part of the Rift Valley is this giant barren desert called Core, K-O-R. There are a couple of reasons I have an intrigue about this. There was one spot in the Core Center where there's a guest house, and the guest house had a big sign in the front, and I popped out and took pictures of it with it. And you would know that because the Ebenezer is the name of the guest house, and I thought that's kind of unique since that was the title of the last book that we produced right here from this chair in this site. And as a consequence, we got started in it. And I said, here we are in the middle of nowhere. I mean, we are absolutely at the most remote spot we have seen because we're in the desert. And there was something behind us called the Hill of Bandits. And it attained notoriety because it was from that spot that people could see any passing camel caravan. It would run down and rustle the camels. That was the reason it got its name. So in the interval between our operating days, I would walk up there with Sam. The reason that he wanted to walk up there is that that might give him some satellite connection to his girlfriend back in Michigan, and he'd be able to make a phone call for that. I let that happen at some distance while I looked around, discovered a bat-eared fox, saw the big Cory bustard, and a couple of other wildlife forms moving around. But more fascinating, I then turned around and looked back at where we were at Buriaramia. And there's the clinic, which is a tiny building, and standing next to it, dwarfing the clinic, are these 2 big white mobile surgical units. In the middle of the Core Desert, I said, if ever you need a definition of remote, have a look at this. Because in all directions, you can see maybe 50 kilometers, and you can see nothing else. It's just windswept desert. How is it possible that we're here with these big mobile surgical units to service the middle of a desert?
Good God.
This is a great Rift Valley, right? And there are people moving through it all the time. They do it cleverly, usually at night, so they don't get scorched by the sun, and they don't have that high requirement for water. And here are we, as we appear, the whole clinic is surrounded. Underneath the mobile surgical units, using the shade of the big trucks, are crowds of colorful people. Included in that crowd is a number of the women who are coming in with their children. They are largely Rendili. They are often mixed with the other nomadic peoples moving through. So as a consequence, I saw more people coming out of the middle of the desert. It's almost as though they were spontaneous generation. They were coming straight out of the desert sand, fascinating as it is, there was no way that we could see them all, so we got 2 or 3 people trained up to take care of them when you're gone. So we did a lot of operating, we did a lot of teaching, we indigenized the care there. We also went to see a fellow who was a nurse who was stationed in a spot even more remote than we were. We went to see him, and we arrived just in time. And just in time, meaning for my purposes, not for his. He would have been delighted if we could have arrived earlier.
There's your Ebenezer. I had to dig that out. That was...
He was doing a work in the library stacks here to find the title for the guest house in Buriaramia.
I tell you what, by the time you come back, I'm going to try and get our technology up to snuff.
It looks like it's working pretty well now. I don't think that there's any need for professional technology with amateur staff, but we've got it working well.
We got to get this properly done. And
well, the fascinating thing about this fellow was that he knew I was coming and therefore wanted to hold off on this woman who was in labor, and he was going to come and deliver her if she were a normal delivery. But he opens up and takes a scope and looks in the vagina, and there's a foot, sort of shaking hands with a foot. And he said, "Oh dear, what do we do about this?" Well, we'll have to try to get him over to where the mobile surgical units are. But there's no way to communicate. There's no vehicle to take her or anything like that. So he then said, "Oh dear, what do I do about this?" And so he looks again, and now he sees not a foot, he sees 2 little feet. This is a double footling breach in obstetric terms. Now, he has not seen it, hasn't learned about it, hasn't heard about it, doesn't know anything about it, but he has one book, and that book is sort of a where there is no doctor, kind of, and he then looks up, and he looks at it, and he says, I don't know, I can't, I have to do something, but we can't get out of here because there's no vehicle, and so I hope the fellow comes over here, and we'd be able to get him to do it, maybe a C-section, but he said he was going to be here tomorrow, and this was today. So this fellow, I'm talking about the heroes of the mission, and that isn't me, and it isn't the units, because the units don't take care of people. It's the people who do, and here's one of them. He reaches in there, and he says, well, I got my hand in there, and I don't know, put my hand in there with the glove, and I found this little hole, and he pulls down and does a delivery, the Piper maneuver it's called, of the aftercoming head, successfully delivered a double footling breech. Now, in Montgomery County here, that would be an instant C-section. There would be no... but this is what you do, and here's this woman nursing a baby, mother and baby doing fine, thank you, with what you would have to call an unlettered and untrained individual, but with motivation. That's why I say the skill is teachable. The motivation has to be a BYO. You bring that, and I will do anything I can to transmit that skill for someone so motivated. He's one of our heroes. He's the one that will be taking care of the clinic in our absence, and we tried to bring him along with us. And in the next missions, he's going to go as one of the trainers after we spend a week with him. So Buriaramia, superb. I'll give you one more, and one more is Lysamus, which is the subculture, the sub-county center, because there's a doctor there. A doctor that made it a referral center. Well, we were there, parked our big units, and said, okay, let's see what operating. Well, no, the hospital had been built by the government of Kenya, but the cement bags in the mixer were in the operating room. This had been now 4 or 5 years now, hasn't been opened, but the structure is there. Don't complain to me. See, you got a hospital. What's your problem? Well, the problem is that no one has a clue, and so there is no skill there. So let me talk to the doctor. So his little office is sitting next to a huge row of benches where the women come and go, and he writes usually one word. In this case, he said there was a Kala Azar epidemic going on, and so his single response was Ka test, which is a radio immunoassay of a single droplet of blood. I never saw one positive while we were there, but he said he was busy. I said, well, let me take you to the mobile surgical units. I'll teach you how to do a few cases. Oh, yeah, I'd be fascinated to do that. He didn't move from that seat 6 meters to the mobile surgical units, didn't even look at them after he saw them parked there. And why? He said he would speak Kiswahili. That's the national language, he said. Well, there's nobody there that speaks Kiswahili. They're not related to the government of Kenya. They are very distant from it. And so he would have a single woman, who was a very capable midwife, do the translation from Kiswahili to the local Rendili language. And that was the practice of medicine. So he never moved. So that referral center with a doctor was a doctor who wasn't even involved to the degree that he could talk to the people. He didn't understand their language. There was a Catholic mission adjacent, which had formerly had an Italian sponsor, and they'd had a priest that came on over, a priest but no doctor. And they were diligently trying to keep that thing going with a local midwife nurse. And so the next trip, we are not going to the government hospital, which is a structure without function. We're going to go to that mission hospital because there they had the motivation. So we did what we could do in these 6 venues I just described, 1 week each, and in the best of them, probably Karungu, the wonderful part of them, like Gatab, and the very effective one, like Turkana, they're balanced against things like Lysamus, which is, okay, we know you're there, we're going to take care of you. Look, we built a hospital, what's your complaint? There's no skill. So our job is to transmit the skill and make sure that that's useful in perpetuity after we leave. Transect 2 of our African transects, 3 in number, of 2019, employed these mobile surgical units to do what it is that they can do well. After that, it's a human skill, and our human skill is that which has to remain behind. So I hope in the next transect that you hear, which is transect 3 of 2019, to be followed within the week, this week, by the 2020 African transects, that in each one of these we are going to make African skills to carry on for African patients. And it's not a white man off a plane or coming out of these 2 big, wonderful white units, because the white units don't treat people. The white units are useful facilities in which to teach people to carry on the care for their brothers, sisters, uncles, and their cattle culture relatives in a social network.
Wonderful. My God. Well, all I can do is wish you all the best, and we'll try and get up to speed to try and match a little bit of your technology. That is far more important, but we'll see. Okay?
The technology without the content is of no value. So let's talk the content, and if the technology supports it, so
right on. Okay, sir.
Thank you much.
Right. Now we just click that, right?